Upstream listeners, I'm excited to announce that registration is now open for the Colson Center National Conference happening May 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Indianapolis. This year's theme is Earth Crammed with Heaven, an invitation to encounter God in His mighty works. Join speakers like Justin Bailey, Ryan Bomberger, Dr. Kristen Collier, and many more as we explore glories often referenced but rarely explored, the truths and beauties that claim our wonder and demand our protection. God has filled His creation with His presence. He has blessed His world with His glory. The Colson Center National Conference is an invitation to see God as He has made Himself known and to encounter Him and His mighty works. Register now at colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. If you have read, listened to, or knew Chuck Colson, you'll remember that he had a pantheon of theologians and Christian thinkers he would quote in discussions about theology and worldview. But toward the end of his life, Chuck looked to one guiding light more than any other, Dutch theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper, who famously said that there's not one square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry out, "Mine." But Kuyper was not primarily a political thinker. He was first and foremost a theologian, and his ideas about worldview and Christian witness flowed from that theology. And together with Herman Bavinck, another early 20th century Dutch theologian who's become a posthumous celebrity of sorts, Kuyper developed a theology sometimes called Neo-Calvinism. And to this day, it's at the heart of what we do and believe at the Colson Center. But what is Neo-Calvinism? What does it have to do with old-fashioned Calvinism? What does it say about creation, about grace, about sin, about worldview, about Jesus? Well, joining me today are two gentlemen who've devoted themselves to answering those questions in a precise and easy-to-understand way. Cory is minister at St. Columba's Free Church of Scotland in Edinburgh, an adjunct lecturer in theology at Edinburgh Theological Seminary and Belhaven University in Jackson, Mississippi. Sutanto is assistant professor of systematic theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. They've just written an outstanding book. It's called Neo-Calvinism, a Theological Introduction. And we're going to devote today's show to talking about that. Cory, Gray, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks for having us, Shane.
Glad to be here.
Well, I'm assuming people listening to this podcast are already predisposed to be interested in the concept of worldview, but they might not know that these two names are closely associated with that concept or even know much about them beyond the famous quotes that we always hear, like the every square inch quote. Who were Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, and why do they matter for Christians of all stripes interested in worldview today?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Well, they were 19th century Dutchmen, and they were born into very different circumstances. Bavinck was born into a thoroughgoing conservative Christian household that had separated from the Dutch state church over very serious questions about the theological trajectory of that church. Kuyper, on the other hand, was a minister in that national church. And Kuyper came to faith in Christ while he was a pastor, a minister in that church.
You think that would be a prerequisite to being a pastor?
You would think, yeah. And he discovered, I think, that he didn't understand the gospel until he had begun his ministry. And eventually they will come together. I mean, Bavinck is some years younger than Kuyper and saw Kuyper as a growing national celebrity of sorts in Kuyper's early career in the Netherlands. Kuyper became a politician. He started a university in 1880. He led a movement out of that state church. And by 1892, he and Bavinck will be the two figureheads that will form a new denomination, the Reformed Church in the Netherlands. And from there, that's sort of the way we want to define Neo-Calvinism. It's a historic movement where Kuyper and Bavinck as figureheads are doing things like founding a university, setting up a new denomination. Bavinck's writing his Reformed Dogmatics, which becomes the chief work of this new movement that gets labeled not by them first, but by reviewers, Neo-Calvinism, as early as the 1880s. This carries on all the way to about 1920 and 1921 when they're going to die. They become immense public figures in the Netherlands, and then their work starts to spread beyond. And of course, as you well know, it creates an entire, as we've said in other places, a river from which all sorts of tributaries have sprung, the Colson Center being one of them, and of course, hundreds more all over the world. They were incredibly important theologians and both also politicians, at least at some point, with Abraham Kuyper becoming prime minister at one point. They've been formative internationally and shaped an international community at this point, and they continue to do that because we're translating their writings and people are enjoying it.
This concept of Calvinism is something I think may get in the way, because obviously our listeners at the Colson Center, our staff at the Colson Center is very ecumenical. I mean, we've always had kind of a confluence of Catholics and Protestants. We've got a lot of different stripes of Protestant working with us. And so looking to figureheads of this movement called Neo-Calvinism can sometimes be problematic, especially when we're in this American context where Calvinism tends to mean, well, a lot of different things to a lot of people and a lot of different narrow things. I remember years ago when, Bill Clinton said that he attributed some economic tendency of his to the fact that he was such a Calvinist, right? And and he wasn't talking about soteriology. He wasn't talking about tulip or the 5 points. He was talking about like the Protestant work ethic. So help us understand, if you guys would, what Calvinism means in the neo-Calvinist context, because I don't want that to be a barrier word that keeps people from appreciating, Kuyper and Bavinck's insights. I'm a Calvinist, doesn't keep me from appreciating, but I anticipated it might be that for some people.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer this question. So Calvinism, for a lot of Americans, especially because of the influence of people like John Piper and the new Calvinist movement of the 20th century and early 21st century, they associated with the so-called 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, perseverance of the saints, blah, blah, blah. And so they associate this with just a particular set of doctrines on predestination and God unconditionally electing you so that you might be saved, and so on. And Kuyper and Bavinck, who are aware of that particular interpretation, or maybe a broader interpretation of that, which is that Calvinism refers to Reformed confessional theology. And tulips, the so-called 5 points, is just one facet of that confessional theology. And they argued, however, that Calvinism as a term is broader than that Reformed theological vision. Calvinism as a term for them referred to the way in which God is sovereign, and hence we all live under the presence of God and before the face of God. And that demanded that you live your life in accordance with His law, His word, in every area of life, because you're always standing before His presence. And so they argued, if Reformed theology refers to a confessional theological vision that has to do with how the church institution has to carry itself out in terms of the ordination standards and what you're guided by, Calvinism refers to a whole cosmology. Bavinck uses the word physiognomy, which is kind of a whole view of the cosmos, right? And so there's a distinct view of science, art, and everything like that flow from this Reformed theological vision. Now, why Calvin then, not just Reformed cosmology or Reformed worldview or something? Well, they would argue that Calvin tried to instill that vision in the context of Geneva, but they also argued that we needed to modify what Calvin did and update it by way of a re-reflection on Scripture because of the modern conditions of the time. So they reconsidered whether or not we should have an established church movement. They would argue that the modern conditions have helped us to see the emphasis of Scripture with regard to the way in which God is patient with unbelievers. And if God is patient, God is giving us common grace. That means that if Christians become lords in the sort of kingly or stately sphere, then it doesn't mean that they should implement the Christian religion as the established church, because that would go against the order of the day. In other words, in this present redemptive historical order, God is patient with unbelief. And so we have to be patient with unbelievers, because if Christ is Lord, then we are not Lord, right? And I keep repeating that because you mentioned the every square inch quote from Abraham Kuyper. That's been misused so much because people think, well, if Christ is Lord, that means we've got to take over. We've got to transform everything. This is a sort of over-realized eschatology. This is almost a post-millennialist sort of view of transformationalism. that we got to spread the kingdom of God by way of human labor and advancement. And that's not Kuyper's view at all. Kuyper's view is that if Christ is Lord, we got to listen to where we are right now and what time it is. And if this is the time of God's patience, then we got to create conditions where we can reform justice for the sake of not just the Christian community, but for the sake of every worldview to pursue their own direction in every structure of life. And that's a very different vision than I think how people often took it.
I could just summarize what Gray said by saying Calvinism is in some ways it's a symbol, and that symbol, you could throw it back a level and say it's Augustinianism. And as Kuyper very cheekily says, Calvinism, which is Augustinianism, is nothing more than the message of the Apostle Paul from the top of Rome and its 7 hills, and it's simply to say that God matters for everything, that God matters for all of life. And Gray laid out the details, but that's the basic concept.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like the modification or the neo part really comes in, especially in the civil sphere, and when it comes to what the life of the church looks like on a society-wide basis. So if you were to bring Calvin back and just sort of put him in conversation with Kuyper and Bavinck, it seems like they would have a lot that they agree on because they're starting from these similar foundations, and these guys owe a lot of what they believe to Calvin. But then Calvin was obviously very much for this established church order that ordered civil life and was willing to bring even civil censure, and at least one famous case against heretics, people who are advancing false religion. And this is a view that's not unique to Calvin. It gets codified in all the major kind of Reformed confessions, the original Westminster Confession, not the American version that gets changed for all of us over on this side, but the original one actually just explicitly says it's the duty of the civil magistrate to promote true religion and basically suppress false religion and heresy. So if you've got these, is it fair to say that this is where a big disagreement's going to emerge between those? And sort of, what do you think Calvin's main argument would be? And what do you think Bavinck and Kuyper's main argument would be?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a lot of nuances here and a lot of details. Calvin didn't want to be wrapped up in the Servetus controversy. And it's important to remember in that controversy that it was the Roman Catholic Church that had condemned Servetus, and he had fled to Geneva, and Calvin didn't know what to do at first, and it was all a mess. And I think he ultimately made a mistake by suggesting to the magistrate, it was the decision of the magistrate what to do with him.
I feel like they should have just shipped him over to the Inquisition and been like, you Catholics, you can deal with him.
Yeah, well, that probably been a little better. It'd been definitely pushing the problem just back one level, right. I guess. But yeah, you're right, of course, that Kuyper and Bavinck and us, for that matter, want to come and say that was an inappropriate application of the first table of God's law upon the civil order, and that is actually perpetually inappropriate. So there are nuances here. Is there a way where you can uphold the Westminster Confession's concept of promoting true religion? Well, perhaps. I think Bavinck and Kuyper want to leave some room for that. They're not against a Christian commonwealth. It's just the question of how that commonwealth comes about and in what ways it's regulated. And for them, I think what they want to see is they want to see the church's ministry be so important and so powerful, the movement of the Spirit so significant, that the magistrate, the state, does recognize its dependency upon God, that the state does say we're absolutely dependent upon God, but doesn't codify that into an application to the point of applying the first table of the law to people who aren't Christians. Simply, it's one where we acknowledge that the reason we have the possibility of justice in the court is because God exists. That's about as much as it needs to be. And actually, it's Christianity then, in the mind of the magistrate, who can protect the freedom of all religions. That's precisely, it's Christianity that guarantees that freedom, that you don't have to believe in the Trinity to be a good citizen in the midst of the commonwealth that we have, even if it is a majority Christian commonwealth. And so, yeah, they would fundamentally disagree with Calvin and many others on that point, and the way the confession originally put it, to the degree that the back half of that clause, that they're to actually enforce the first table of the law, enforcing the second table of the law, of course, because that's a universal ethic for all, but not the first. Yeah, that would be a major disagreement. As far as to how Calvin would come and defend himself, I'm not too sure. I think it's important to say that this is a very live discussion. This is not a 19th century versus 15th century, 16th century discussion. This is exactly the discussion we're having right now in reference to movements like Christian nationalism and all of its many ways it can be defined. But the Neo-Calvinist position is an alternative, I would suggest, to both Christian nationalism on the one hand. Now, I know that can be defined in many ways, but it's an alternative to that, and what could be an opposite sort of mere liberalism sort of position, a mere religious liberty sort of idea for all. And Neo-Calvinism comes and says, well, no, Christianity gives a nation the impetus and the power from the bottom up to actually believe in freedom. Paul says that to us right in 1 Timothy 2, that he desires that all people would be saved, including the king, so that there can be peace in the land for the church. But in the age of patience, common grace, that means there's got to be peace in the land for all religions. That would be one of the distinctives.
One more contextual clue to this is that Kuyper was working under the conditions of modernity, and one of the ways in which modernity argued for their position is that we want an age of freedom and tolerance, and religion is not going to give us that, but rather this neutral secularism is going to give us that. So we want freedom for all religions, freedom for every worldview, because we want a more secularized sort of state. And Kuyper's argument was, on secular foundations, you can't have freedom. You can't have tolerance because you don't have the resources to understand religions in itself, because you have the tendency to say religions are byproducts of our physical makeup, religions are wishful thinking, religions are, wish fulfillment, whatever else. But with Christianity, you've got theology, a theology that tells you that these other religions will exist because of general revelation, image of God. But sin means that we'll suppress the truth and produce idols instead of worshiping the real God. But because of God's common grace, we can be patient with them. So unlike modernism, Kuyper says, we're not going to reduce all the other worldviews to really just one modern idea, which is, humanism or whatever else. And then on the other hand, we're not Roman Catholicism, which wants conformity, or Islam, which wants conformity. Only Christianity can provide the pluralism that modernity actually wants but could not have. This is quite a method of subversive fulfillment. So even though, yes, it's a civil focus in terms of the Neo and the Neo-Calvinism, there is still this theological vision underneath it, which is broader than just the civil life. And that's what the book focuses on. That all these theological doctrines are being deployed in a particular way. And some of the doctrines are kind of new developments that is a rediscovery of biblical passages that might have been neglected before. And so there's an intense civil focus, but also an extensive doctrinal sort of movement here, and a seeking to understand or re-understand Christian doctrine in light of new conditions.
Yeah, I do want to focus the main part of our discussion on the theological underpinnings here, especially zeroing in on the 16 theses that you draw out of the work of Kuyper and Bavinck toward the end of the book. But I think one last thing deserves to be asked and said on the civil issue, because I think that quote that you talked about, the every square inch quote, does get applied in ways that maybe Kuyper himself wouldn't have agreed with. And, full disclosure, I'm post-millennial in my eschatology, so I like those applications. I think that's probably a good application. But I think we need to be honest about what they actually thought and what they're actually saying in their project here. And so there's an instance here where our American context can confuse us once again. So when you talk about Kuyper and Bavinck being pro-freedom of religion and not wanting an established state church or something like that, maybe that's not exactly a fair summary of what they thought, but that's what I'm kind of gathering. I think what Americans often hear is a much stronger claim that secularists often make, which is that you basically, when you enter the political world, whether through voting or occupying public office, you leave your religion behind, right? Your religion no longer affects what you do, and you cannot legislate morality. That's the phrase that gets thrown out there. So a secular person, let's just bring Nancy Pelosi into this for the sake of argument, right? Nancy Pelosi would say, my church has an opinion about abortion, but I don't bring that opinion into my political work because that would be legislating morality and therefore establishing a religion. Bavinck and Kuyper are not saying that sort of thing. They're not saying you can't make legislation that reflects Christian morality. Help us kind of keep that distinction in mind, if you would.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, one of the ways that Bavinck and Kuyper will want to discipline the American scene is by coming in and saying true freedom is to put away this dualistic version of public argument that actually bifurcates the self. It bifurcates the self into this public person, this private person. It separates the spirit and from matter. It separates mind from heart. It does all these little dualisms that they want to say that is actually the mechanical move. That's how they use the word mechanistic. It's not true. It's not an organism. It's not a unity of parts. It's you not being who you really are. And so they think that's exactly what sin does to the world. And so we should never act like that. So when it comes to the political realm, they want to say, argue your heart and soul out from a biblical perspective, form a Christian political party, and shape the Commonwealth by way of that stream. So give a fair hearing. So if a Christian political party does win the day, then it can express its arguments and its movements through that without at the same time establishing Christianity as a state church or as something that is imposed in its most precise religious systems upon people. So Christianity actually had the power to give freedom to all the opinions. And because the Netherlands is a Christian nation, historically, it's a part of Christendom, they believed that the freedom that had arisen both to speak from a religious perspective in the public square and yet give freedom no matter what to all to do that was a Christian move, a Christian perspective that arose from Christendom. And so the American model is one that wouldn't be participating in a Neo-Calvinist view in that way, precisely because of the Nancy Pelosi argument that you just gave, this separation between public and private, religious and, quote, reason. And we want to say, no, all reason is mixed in with faith. There is no separation of religion and reason. Even if you try to do it, you end up just advocating for a very particularized type of religion, which is just typically agnostic secularity of some sort. So yeah, it would be exactly as you've put it, a denial of that kind of move.
Yeah, right. Plus the idea that Nancy Pelosi or anyone of her persuasion is not bringing metaphysical, religious, theological, moral commitments into their work is just, it's ridiculous. They're just denying what's obvious.
Well, what it creates is a culture in the 21st century across the Western nations where being a politician is a career choice. It's not derivative of actually possessing the wisdom to rule, right? And the wisdom to rule comes about through religion, through that which religion provides, through proverbial wisdom, through the establishment that you've shown other people throughout your life that you know how to act according to God's law in certain situations, and you've garnered the respect due to rule a nation. Now we've separated religion so much from the political, we now just have career politicians that make the choice to do such a thing, to be a politician, to use the institution as their platform, as we often say, and nevertheless never have actually established themselves as people who have the wisdom to govern. And I think that largely has to do with the separation of religion from the public square.
That's helpful. I want to move on to the theological concepts here that you get to, because in many ways the book is premised on this, you call it a lacuna, right? A gap in the scholarship and at popular level work on Bavinck and Kuyper. And that is that Kuyper especially gets pitched as like this public theologian. And he certainly was that, but he had a rich underpinning of Christian theology that created that public theology that led him to those conclusions in public, in the service of the government and so forth. And so Bavinck obviously is this figure who, for many American Christians especially, was just unknown until fairly recently. Much of his work was not even translated until fairly recently into English. And so we need to understand that foundation. And that's what this book is all about, really. I want to open the floor for you guys, because there's 16 theses that you sort of use to summarize the work of the chapters of this book, distinctives of Neo-Calvinism that you think can be sort of distilled down and expressed in short statements. I want to throw open the floor, though, to you guys to summarize it even more deeply. Like if you were going to come at the Neo-Calvinist project and say, what is it that sets this thing apart? What is the posture or the two or three things that just stick in your mind as non-negotiables or characteristics of it? What would they be?
That's a tough question, Shane, because you could answer it in so many different ways and so many different angles. I think maybe we'll highlight a couple here. I mean, in the introduction and conclusion, we highlight, for instance, the holistic character of Christianity, which implies a particular view of Catholicity. I think when we think about Catholicity, this idea of the universality of the Christian faith, people usually think about the rootedness of Christianity in the past, right? And we talk about the genealogy of creeds and confessions that we receive today as confessional Christians as exemplifying the way in which we're Catholic Christians. But I think Bavinck and Kuyper understand the Catholicity of Christianity in a very nuanced way. It's not less than that, it's more than that. They want to add to that. They want to argue that it's not just about rootedness in the past, increasing confessions, but it's about the pliability of the Christian faith, that it is not identifiable with one particular culture. It's not tethered to just one particular philosophy. It's able to use any philosophy that it finds. And so there is no perennial philosophical handmaiden for the Christian faith. And there is no one culture that is perennially the Christian faith. So they argue that Roman Catholicism, and this is controversial perhaps, but they argue that Roman Catholicism is a contradiction in terms, because Roman is a particularizing thing, and Catholicism is a universalizing thing. So they argue, just as Christianity was able to leaven Jewish culture and Greco-Roman culture, and now it could leaven modern culture, it could leaven Dutch culture differently than would leaven American culture. And there is no need for a uniformity. And so there's this vision, therefore, this holism of Catholicity trickles down to their view of the organism, again, of the church, which is that it develops organically. Now, you have to be tethered. There's a root, there's a trunk, and that's the conservative part of it. But there is that so-called leavening, developing part of it as well, as Christianity grows through time and place. And this is rooted in their view of the cultural mandate as well. As people who are made in the image of God and are regenerated to be renewed in the image of God are spreading across the earth, it sees the image of God flourishing and developing in surprising ways. And as that collective entity of the image of God reflects the one triune God, we see a fuller vision of the glory of God on earth, if that makes sense. So lots of doctrines there. There's, particular doctrine of the church, particular doctrine of the image of God, which is, again, underpinning these impulses towards holism and towards Catholicity. So I think maybe we'd start there.
This is a really good point that you've brought up, and I want to interrogate it a little bit without cutting Cory off, because I know you've probably got some great stuff to say. But I listened to an interview recently where Hans Boersma came on Mere Fidelity with Matthew Lee Anderson and Derek Rishmawy, and he's a Christian Platonist, so he actually has this pretty firm devotion to the idea that some species of Platonic philosophy is actually the right philosophy, like it's the right metaphysic, the right description of the way things work above and beyond the physical realm, and that Christianity is sort of married to that, or that's essential for articulating the Christian position. And he basically says Augustine would back me up on this, right? This is how we should look at things. I want to interrogate that Kuyperian, Bavinckian, if we can say that, conviction that Christianity is very flexible or adaptable to any philosophy or any culture, with that question. Like, isn't there a true metaphysic? Isn't somebody right and everybody else wrong? And doesn't Christianity, in the creedal sense, depend on many Greek philosophical concepts like essence and person and the distinction between those and so forth? What do you guys think?
I have lots of thoughts on that. So I think first of all, I think that sort of claim is very historically untethered to the phenomenon of how Christianity actually historically arose. And, if you read Hilary Hurtado, for instance, there was almost a suddenness and this leavening character of Christian faith that really did transform and reform Greco-Roman society. In other words, the Christian faith wasn't received as just another permutation of Platonism in the Greco-Roman world. It was something really new. They had produced a different sexual ethic. There was a bookish religion. It made a distinction between religion and culture. That's one of Larry Hurtado's arguments in that book, for instance. So that's one side of things. And then the other side is, I think if you read Augustine, right? And I'm sure Boersma would agree with this as well. Augustine would argue where Plato agrees with the Christian faith, it's not because the Christian faith is borrowing from Platonism, but Plato must have been reading, I think on Christian teaching, he says Plato was reading Jeremiah. And then Augustine later on in The City of God said, well, he couldn't have been reading Jeremiah. Maybe he was reading Moses. Okay, maybe he wasn't reading Moses. Okay, fine. He was just getting it from Romans 1, right? In other words, the idea that God has revealed himself to every person. So where Plato got it right, it's not because we have to draw from Plato, but rather Plato was living on Christian ground, if that makes sense. So it's the other way around. Plato was actually learning from the God of the Bible without knowing the God of the Bible, namely the God is revealed in nature and creation. We want to draw from Plato where he's consistent with us, but at the same time, Augustine would not want to say that we depend on Plato. He thinks that he's the best of the philosophers, but only insofar as he's consistent with Christian teaching. I think the best Thomists would say the same thing about Aristotle. Not all Thomists say it, but I think the best Thomists would say the same as well. Thirdly, therefore, we can say that some philosophies are consistent with the Christian faith, and not just that philosophy as a whole, because as we know, Augustine subverted Plato's understanding of the recollection of the soul, Plato's understanding of soul-body dualism, things like that.
And Thomists subvert Aristotle's understanding of like an eternal universe and everything.
Absolutely. And so, take some of the works on divine simplicity, even Stephen Duby's recent work says this, there was a transformation of these Greek terms that were being used by Christian theologians. They didn't just take substance in Aristotle's category and said, that's exactly what God is like. In fact, I think Duby, in the beginning of Jesus and the God of Classical Theism, said something to the effect of substance in Aristotle's categories was significantly redefined by the Christian theologians, that if an Aristotelian were to look at the way in which Christian theologians were using these Aristotelian terms, they would be surprised by it, right? And I think we need to be reminded of that fact. So, and here's Bavinck's insight too. I think we got to zoom out here, right? So if we're talking about doctrine of God, you can take lines and certain texts from Plato and Aristotle and say, Metaphysics 7 or Plato's dialogues. Yeah, all right, there's lots of things about the good there. God is simple, immutable, blah, blah, blah. We want to take that. That's good for our doctrine of God. But Bavinck and Kuyper tells us, okay, let's zoom out. What about Aristotle and Plato's view of humanity? Well, we would definitely reject that. And then you zoom into not Kant's, let's say, metaphysic, but Kant's, say, views of freedom and authenticity and what it means to flourish as a human being. There's more common ground, they would argue, with Kant on those issues, but not necessarily on the relation between faith and religion, faith and reason. Does that make sense? So I had a conversation with someone at a conference back in Denver, ETSAR, and they said, isn't Plato just more close to Christianity? Well, if you take just a narrow slice of Plato and you only take Kant's critique of pure reason, then sure, Plato's, let's say, sections of Plato's Republics are closer to the Christian faith than Kant's sections and critiques of pure religion. But if you zoom out and consider the ways in which Kant presupposed the distinction between sort of the freedom of the individual and the right of the church, Kuyper and Bavinck would actually say there's some things we can learn from Kant there. So in an arresting passage in The Future of Calvinism, Bavinck says something to the effect of Kant showed us Calvinism's respect for freedom. Schopenhauer showed us Calvinism's understanding of the radicality of depravity. So you got to zoom out here and not just talk about some loci. So it doesn't make sense to just say Christianity is Christian Platonism. But Christianity could use parts of Plato, parts of Kant, parts of Schopenhauer, parts of whoever, because we are made in the image of God, and no philosopher is therefore all bad and all good at the same time. There has to be a mixed bag in each philosopher. So we'll start there.
You guys are not sort of, and Bavinck and Kuyper would not propose a sort of equal ultimacy among philosophies. Like they're all just as good, take your pick. Like there are some philosophies that have more truth than others. There are some that are just really bad.
More truth on others and some loci and others, right? In other words, you take Plato's understanding of the good, there's more common ground there than somebody else's understanding of the good. But again, zoom out and we would reject Plato's understanding of the role of human society or, the layers of human society or the idea of, at least I would reject the idea of a philosopher king who could do, lottery marriages and things like that. So
abolishing the family, we probably wouldn't be on board with that. Kids raised by the state, lying to people and trying to make them pretend that they were just, they popped into existence after their education was done and stuff.
and I confess, I was trained at first in analytic philosophy. So I was, to me, it's like we could learn a lot from 20th century, 19th century analytic philosophy as well. Go ahead, Cory.
No, that was an excellent answer. I mean, everything Grace said is so much of the same thoughts I had. I mean, I guess I'd just summarize by saying I don't understand the impulse to create a moniker, a name in which it sounds as if Christianity is dependent upon a particular philosophy that we call Platonism. I don't understand why someone would want to take that name and make it prescriptive. Now, if it's merely descriptive as an aspect of historical theology of a thing that did develop, then that's fair enough. But to suggest that it is Christianity in itself is to wed Christianity to a philosophy in a way that we just don't have such a thing existing in the Acts of the Apostles. It's a historical development, and it's not necessary. It's accidental. Yes, there's plenty that Plato was helpful to us about, but as Grace mentioned earlier, when you actually studied the terminology of the hypostatic union, you studied the terminology of the divine life ad intra as we've developed it, you see that what the church fathers and others ended up meaning by person, substance, subsistence, as Gray mentioned, is actually defined in a radically different way than it is in the Greek philosophers. It's the term is borrowed, the concepts are redeployed in a new way. And so I have a hard time finding this quote unquote great tradition that gets spoken of or understanding what it is or what it means exactly. Others have said the same thing. I think there was an essay on the London Lyceum. I can't remember who wrote it that dealt with this in a really helpful way. So anyway, just to echo all that Grace said and say that I would never want to wed Christianity to a specific philosophy, a natural philosophy, and then call that Christianity. And I'm not sure why anyone would want to do that.
And so general revelation is always something other than one particular philosopher's reception of general revelation. That's really important. One more point too, in terms of missions, this is really important because if you're going to China or where I was from, Indonesia, I'm not going to be teaching them Plato. I'm going to teach them the Nicene Creed. I'm going to teach them the Westminster Confession of Faith. But I'm not going to say, okay, read Plato. But instead, I would probably read with them the Quran. I would read with them some of the Hadiths. I would read with them in some circles in Chinese and Indonesian context, Confucius, right? And say, okay, this is your tradition. How has Confucius received even the God of the Bible without knowing the God of the Bible's name? Does that make sense? That would be the missiological sort of impetus of this. And that's, I think, a Neo-Calvinist instinct as well.
Use Confucius as sort of the altar to the unknown God.
Right. And so the reason why the early church used Plato and Aristotle or the Stoics or whatever is because of missiological context. It's just what they were working with. This is their context in which they found it. So to say that we got to keep going back, because, I just can't imagine, and I'm thinking of our church plant back in Jakarta. Hey, let's read Plato together. Maybe to understand Augustine, we'll do that. But in terms of how to reach these people, they're reading other philosophical texts. And so we got to go to what they're reading instead, right?
Christianity always depends in its theological grammar on philosophy, always, and it always has. But it's contextual. It's about where you are. If the gospel goes to a place that's seeking to speak a new language that's never spoken before, it's going to adopt the language and grammar of that particular philosophical milieu. And that's what Bavinck and Kuyper are saying. You're right, as you point out, there are absolutely better philosophies than others. And Gray and I recognize Plato is so much better than so much 20th century philosophy. But there are insights in 20th century philosophy that Plato never got to that have been incredibly important, especially about language, especially about our finitude that speak to Christianity in a really helpful way.
Yeah. You mentioned, Gray, a second ago, the concept of common grace that's at work in Bavinck and Kuyper. And I think we need to pay some special attention to this concept because it often gets misunderstood or just conflated with other understandings of common grace. What is distinctive about the Neo-Calvinist tradition on common grace, and especially as it relates to God's self-revelation, his general revelation? What's going on there that's different that we need to pay close attention to?
Wow, that's a great question. I think common grace has always been there in the Christian tradition. So when you talk about the glimmers or the remnants of the image of God that still are retained after the fall, or the splendid vices of the pagans, take whichever, I think, early church father or the reformers, they always had that sort of language to account for the goodness that we perceive in the supposedly sinful or depraved unbeliever. And so they wanted to codify that language and say, okay, if this is the case, then the reason why some unbeliever X has access to some feature of natural law or general revelation, it's because of common grace rather than nature qua nature. So, in their understanding, if you're just appealing to nature qua nature, then you're going to presume that the unbeliever will always have an agreement with you. And so natural law could become a preamble toward supernatural revelation or the reception of supernatural revelation. But they would argue that that's not the case. If common grace is grace, then there's going to be momentary breakings of their suppression and momentary receptions of some facet of the natural order. But that's going to be dependent on grace. And so you can't count on it. And secondly, because it's grace, you can't credit this to the natural person. In other words, God alone is the reason, and specifically the Spirit of God is the reason why they have access to these truths and access to these abilities for some period of time. So you won't see them sort of just saying things like, well, the point of contact is just nature. Yes, ultimately, but the point of contact is by common grace, if that makes sense. There is the image of God, and they do have momentary access to natural only by common grace. And insofar as in that particular moment, God allows them to have access to that. And so there's some kind of agreement between you and that person. So you're constantly dependent on God. And if that's the case, then, coming back to maybe the simple discussion, can the state, regulate on Christian principles? Absolutely, that common grace is a Christian principle, but what about features from the first table of the law? Only insofar as there's a leavening enough of society that could allow you to legislate that in such a way where the people want it to, and not just something from the top down, if that makes sense. So Bavinck and Kuyper, they would argue what the state legislates has to be very contextualized, depending on the moment of the day, rather than, okay, because this is what the law is, this is what nature is. The state is always the natural preamble to supernature. So we got to just make it sort of the stable, unchanging entity for all time, if that makes sense. It depends on what the people is. So in other words, for contemporary reflection, if there are Muslims in your country, you can't legislate in such a way where the Muslims are going to be barred from something, if that makes sense. But if the work of the church is successful, such that Muslims are converting, or secularists are converting, then you can start to posture the state to reflect the people's desires, if that makes sense. Because by common grace and special grace, that's already happening, and the state is reflective of that.
Right. Help me understand the difference between common grace and the revelation that is implicit in creation or contained in creation by virtue of its having been created by God. So Paul uses this language in Romans of people having no excuse. And so in other words, even if they don't reach those conclusions, even if they don't take advantage of what's given them, they're still culpable because it's all there. Like they could have reached those conclusions. How does that mesh with what you're saying? And then how does the concept that Kuyper and Bavinck have of an innate sense of God's existence that everyone sort of has, independent of reason, how does that play into it?
The difference is that the revelation that comes to every single person is not qua creation any longer because of the fall, right? Because of human sin and rebellion, God has made a choice to preserve and to be patient and to continue to reveal himself through nature, in the self. And now all revelation is categorically common grace. For God to reveal himself is to do so as a gracious act, period. Whenever it says in Romans 1, for example, that the person knows God, all people know God without excuse, this is not, for the Neo-Calvinists, this is not a knowledge that comes by way of syllogism. So it's not that every single person has looked up into the heavens and done the Aristotelian move of saying, well, premise 1, there is motion. Premise 2, there must be a ... all the way to the prime mover, right? It's not Aquinas' 5 ways first. Now, that is possible. We're not denying that. By God's common grace, one can reason in such ways, and that reasoning would be true, right? But that's not the sense of it. Instead, it's that God, by his common grace, has revealed himself both subjectively in giving the human person their own consciousness, that is the common operation of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, as Calvin puts it, is ubiquitous. He's not just the Spirit of saving grace, he's the Spirit of life-giving grace. And everybody can say, in him we live and move and have our being. In him we're birthed by God as Paul puts it in Acts 17. And so the universality of the work of the Spirit through God's common grace results in the fact that everyone knows God subjectively, even if they can't propositionalize it, because God is actually present. It's effective. It's pre-propositional. And the experience with the objective heavens is that God is also there. God is present. God holds up the heavens. And so everybody looks out and is not first moved to syllogisms. They're first moved to gratitude. They're first moved to say thank you to the unknown God. And it's the unknown God who is the true God that they know, because in common grace, God has given a universal operation, a ubiquitous presence of the Spirit, both in them and outside of them. And so the subjective and objective come together in that moment. And so, but for Bavinck, revelation is the secret of all things. It's the secret of consciousness. It's the secret of knowledge. It's the secret of feeling, because it is the case that if God pulls back, then all is lost. Even the self is lost. There is no self without grace.
I love that language of holding creation together after it's been broken, just by grace, just because God's good and he wills to save it. It doesn't have to hold together. In fact, if we had our druthers, it would all fall apart, but he doesn't let that happen. And so that's all a gift, everything.
Yeah. And I think to connect back to your question too about, how does this universal operation of the Spirit, universal general revelation relate to what I said about momentary access, things like that? The momentary access language doesn't refer to the presence of revelation in every person. That's universal and always constant and dynamic and effective. It refers to our ability to suppress or not suppress. In other words, sure, God is always operating in such a way where we have this revelation of God by common grace. But common grace also is that which stops our suppression of that truth in some particular moment. So it's not as if we don't have access to the truth. And sometimes, or in other words, it's not as if sometimes the truth is available and then not available. The truth is always available, but we don't want to receive it. So the problem is a problem of the heart and not a problem of the intellect or presence, if that makes sense. And so, but why is it that some societies want to receive one particular facet and not? It's not because of the lack of access. It's because of the lack of suppression or the ability of the human mind to embrace something that they already know deep inside, if that makes sense.
Right. So would you guys say that Bavinck and Kuyper would endorse the kind of approach I see sometimes where you confront an atheist and you say, yes, I can give you evidences of God's existence, but you already know that God exists. Would they endorse that?
Yeah, I mean, the Neo-Calvinist apologetic tradition is one that doesn't deny the usefulness of proofs, but the way it's developed is really to be more about the affective dimension. And that affective dimension is to help people see God fulfills their needs, the things that they want and long for, the desires of the heart, and the intellectual needs too, that God makes better sense of that the Christian God does. And so, this is part of what Christian worldview is about. This is, as Keller's called it, Christian high theory. It's the idea that God is the best explanation for the fulfillment of the needs of the mind and heart, but it's often the heart that's more important. It's that affective dimension. And so that's been the trajectory of a Neo-Calvinist apologetic tradition, is to move away from the proofs, not because they're not true necessarily, but because they actually aren't as helpful, to use them, but not depend upon them so centrally.
Yeah. And so I think it helps you to actually listen to the person you're engaging with, because there's going to be wrestlings of the heart where they're suppressing and wrestling with what they know deep inside. And that's not necessarily an intellectual effort to get them to admit that. It's kind of like counseling in that respect. There's this psychological emphasis in Neo-Calvinism.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time left here. I want to get to what I think is at the heart of this thing, or very close to the heart of this thing. So Jennifer Marshall Patterson, who teaches at RTSDC, right? She's on the Colson Center board, full disclosure. And she's done a number of kind of lectures and I've written a number of articles about Bavinck in particular. And she thinks that he has a very distinctive idea, and it's that grace restores nature or creation to its original end goal. It does not supersede or replace or destroy it. And you kind of summarize this by saying that the problem with the world is ethical, not ontological, that in Kuyper and Bavinck, it's a moral issue. Sin is the problem, not createdness. And that actually contrasts quite sharply with other versions of Christian theology. Could you unpack that and tell us what they mean by that and why it's so revolutionary to believe that?
Yeah, so I think grace restoring nature, this idea of the problem of the world is not ontological but ethical. In other words, it's not as if God created everything and the natural realm has its own deficiencies immediately, and that itself needs physical remedies or metaphysical remedies.
So our problem is not that we're physical beings, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. Or even the problem is not in our metaphysical makeup. So sin is always an ethical modification, an alien contingent, or to use an Aristotelian term, an accident of creation rather than something substantial. And actually, this is, I think, rooted again in the reception of Reformed Orthodoxy. So if you read anyone, Turretin, Van Maastricht, Leiden Synopsis, God is the author of good, and so God can only create good things. So the only positive things that exist out there are good. And so sin, therefore, cannot be created by God, and hence sin is not something that exists as a substance in itself, because everything that exists in itself is created by God and hence has to be good. So if God is not the author of sin, sin has to be accidental to creation. It's a misuse of something that is originally good. It's parasitic upon it. So it's a privation of the good and a tendency towards evil. And that sin entered into the world by way of Adam's first breaking of the covenant of works, right? So in other words, because Adam did an ethical violation, then the world was put under a curse and we became corrupted. It's not as if there was a natural state that has a deficiency in itself that was brittled by supernatural giftings of God. And so now that after the fall, the natural state is intact, but the supernatural order is taken away from it, right? It's that idea. So if that's the case, then after the fall, everything is corrupted in an ethical sense, and everything is put under a curse because of an ethical violation, right? So common grace explains why everything is not corrupted totally, and special grace, therefore, restores us towards our natural trajectory towards consummation, rather than fixing a mistaken creation to begin with, put it colloquially, yeah.
This is so interesting to me because, I mean, just going back years, but I think this concept has enormous legs. Like it affects how we think about so much of life. So I'll just give one example. A lot of times people talk as if the church is kind of this replacement family, that God's gracious work in the institutional people of God actually supersedes or replaces your natural family and your natural identity. Like you don't need that stuff anymore because what you've got is a new family. And you know, there are certain instances when the church will step in and make up for like a deficiency, a bad family, like, or someone who's rejected Christ. Even Jesus seems to countenance that possibility. But the fact is the church and the family are not in competition, because the family is a created institution that's meant to be here. It's meant to be part of our lives. It's meant to bless us. It's part of God's gracious gift to us. And we don't need to replace that. Now we need to restore it because the family's broken by sin. But that's part of what the gospel does. It's not like this new thing. And the same thing could be said for other institutions of life. The church does not come in and replace who we are as human beings. Its task is to redeem those aspects of our being.
Yeah, but I think another facet that's really important to put in there is that our perception of what it means to be human itself is going to be restored because, again, we have momentary accesses because we want to suppress who we are as human beings. So we mix up what is common with what is natural. So because it's common that our families are this way, this must be a natural facet of the family. And I think the Bible restores us to what is actually normative rather than what is merely normal. So I think, you know, in terms of, you read Larry Hurtado's book again, it seems normal and instinctive that men have a higher sexual libido, and so they have more sexual partners, but women have to be faithful to the man. It seems normal that that's the sense. But Christianity comes in and says, no, that's not normative, even though it's now common in terms of our sinful experiences. And, you know, the Jewish-Gentile relations, it seems normal that we should just huddle together, Jews on one side, Gentiles on the other. That's normal. But then Christianity comes in and says you can be friends and maybe even intermarriage because you have a new God now, and that God is higher than your ethnic and cultural identities.
Yeah, another facet of this would just be that the idea that grace restores nature is to be distinguished from other eschatological perspectives, one of the things we're saying there is what really Neo-Calvinism becomes known for above all else in the 20th century, and that's its big emphasis on creation and on the goodness of the material, on the goodness of the family and the state and all the things you guys were just talking about. But why? Well, it's because we don't have a view in Neo-Calvinism that the grace of God has come into the world to elevate materiality and physicality and creaturely things into a space that's divine in the sense of changing what they are, right? So partaking in the divine life doesn't mean some form of theosis in which we participate ontologically in the ad intra-Trinitarian life, but it does mean partaking in the divine life by way of union with a human, and that human is Jesus, right? And so the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the great pronouncement of grace restores nature, that God has now said in resurrection, I intend creation to be creation for all of eternity, because now God has become man forever in Jesus Christ. The resurrection is never going to cease because it's the Son of God as a man who is resurrected. And so grace restores nature means grace doesn't elevate nature to something beyond its creatureliness. It means that God condescends, and that the project has always been divine condescension, not human ascension. Even in the Garden of Eden, that was always going to be the point.
Right. And you get this interesting union of eschatology with protology in this theology, because the goal toward which we're moving here, the New Jerusalem, the Garden City, the incarnation, God dwelling among us, is actually the same goal that mankind had from the beginning, the concept of God dwelling among his people in this glorified state was always the trajectory. We've been set back on track. And of course, there are distinctives to that. Like we have a dying, rising God because of sin. We would not, in our hypothetical sinless world, have had the need for that. But yeah, that's a really beautiful vision. And it helps us to see that we haven't lost all that's good in God's creation. In fact, he intends to take all those things up and glorify them in his new creation, and is even now doing so.
Right. I mean, how much has the biblical theology movement established this even further? You know, ever since the Dutch Reformed popularized these sorts of notions, you see from Gerhardus Voss forward this way of reading the Bible that doesn't, it's not new in modernity. It goes all the way back to the fathers, but where we are studying better than ever how the garden temple of Eden relates to the garden temple of the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21. In a way where we're seeing this exegetically, these theological principles that Bavinck and Kuyper were so about. Books are being produced on the exegesis of these concepts constantly, and seeing the sacred weaving of all these ideas throughout redemptive history itself as written in Scripture. Well, it's been nothing but a confirmation movement for a lot of what the Neo-Calvinist theology was all about.
Yeah, I'll say maybe as a final note, I'm so thankful that this book is coming out right after Christopher Watkins' Biblical Critical Theory, that shows how so many modern philosophies can't help it but echo Christianity. Yeah, not just Plato, right? And also, Colin Hansen's biography of Keller, intellectual biography of Keller, which shows how much he drew from Neo-Calvinism. And so there's just lots of text right now that's been coming. Translations of J.H. Bavinck, the works of Daniel Strange, James Eglinton, the biography of Bavinck is already out, So there's just lots of, I think, a rehabilitation of the term Neo-Calvinism from what it perhaps was over-associated with in the past.
Yeah. Well, that's actually the last question I want to ask you guys is the term itself, and sort of rehabilitating, or at least making it accessible for a broader audience. It sounds so sectarian. Not only is it a subset of reformational theology, right? Calvinism, but it's Neo-Calvinism. We're really in the weeds now. Could you make the case here as we close that this is actually a deeply Catholic little c way of doing theology that is for all Christians, and that all Christians should be interested in and take seriously?
Well, that's exactly what we think. That's exactly what the project is. As far as the name goes, we're open to suggestions for popularizing the idea.
It's too late. It's on the cover now. In
terms of what it means for the next generation, and how we, one of the things we want to do is move from here and be more prescriptive and also speak these truths at a more popular level than we do in this book. But you're exactly right. What we're suggesting here is that this is a mere Christianity that is truly a Catholic project, a Catholic way. It's a Catholic instinct. Even that's what Neo-Calvinism is adopting from the Reformer himself a very Catholic instinct, as it pertains to looking for truth wherever it can be found. A Catholic instinct for understanding that God matters for every arena of life, every Catholic aspect of reality, for knowing that Christianity can root in every culture and adopt the philosophies of that culture to its own grammar. The Catholicity is in so many levels, so many stages. As far as the sectarianism of the name, yes, you're not the first one that said that to us, and we need to put our thinking caps on perhaps and start saying new words.
If we're writing like a popular level version of this, what would we call it? That's something we would consider. Like what, Colossians 1:15-20? I don't know. Yeah, it's a great question. I do think it's a description of Christianity at its earliest stages, even. So, yeah, it's not meant to be sectarian. The term is important just because historically, the recovery of this Catholic idea was situated, and it's been misused so many times. But we'll keep thinking on that, Shane.
Yeah, let me know what you come up with. I'm fascinated by the subject, and I know my listeners are as well. And this has been a great conversation. Again, with these hour-long conversations, the one thing I always think to myself at the end of it, especially with a book like this, is, golly, we could have gone for like 2 more hours, because we probably hit maybe 4 or 5 of the 16 theses here, and which correspond to the chapters of the book. But this is really great, guys. I appreciate your work. I'm honored to have had this conversation. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
My guests today have been Cory Brock and Gray Sutanto, authors of the new book, Neo-Calvinism, A Theological Introduction. If you're at all inclined, like I am, to figure out how different strains of theology radically affect your posture and the way you engage your culture and society, this is just a must read. So check it out. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.